Welcome back to Speaking Freely, reality without a filter. In 2023, with our media-induced, oversaturated world, is that something any of us can truly expect to experience? In the words of Dawal Sharma, an independent writer on the Medium platform, the unfiltered world cannot be comprehended because reality is simply too massive for us to fathom. Our senses and our brains pare down this reality to make experience possible. Reality goes in one end, experience comes out the other. And it is the latter that makes up what we call life. So, as consumers of the news, we actually depend on producers and journalists in the mainstream media to make those editorial decisions of what aspects of the real world get spoken about and analyzed. We depend on them to pare down the unfiltered reality and frame a more simplified version of it for our convenient consumption, to sift through the oceans of all available information and filter out what they believe to be the most important and relevant facts to share with us, and then leave out the rest. Now, when you hear the word filter these days, we might immediately think of those image filters that many of us have on our cell phones. These are apps that distort real appearances and to remake us into something more glamorous or potentially more entertaining. But what happens when the stories we consume, whether online or within the mainstream media, undergo a similar form of reality enhancement? What happens when the filter that's applied by media creators maybe goes too far in its framing of reality? Now, one person who's struggled with these challenging questions is today's guest, independent journalist, podcaster, Tara Henley. Now, you may recall Tara from an episode of ours from last season where we talked with her about her experiences working within one of the largest newsrooms in the country. It was an experience that at first she found exhilarating, but later became both restrictive and problematic for someone as thoughtful as herself and someone who was progressively minded but not dogmatic. Now, since then, both as an independent broadcaster for her successful Lean Out broadcast and also as a successful writer on her Substack platform, she has focused her attention on news stories and themes that she feels have been largely ignored or have gone underreported by the mainstream media. In her words, one of the goals of her Substack has been to, quote unquote, complicate the dominant narrative. Now, Tara in many ways represents the new breed of independent journalism, which has found a growing audience online. And by going independent, these figures of the new journalism have managed to circumvent those limiting framing devices that are imposed on the content by our corporate media. And also, thanks to the technology, these new independents have also overcome those massive barriers to entry that once limited independent media outlets' reach, things like printing costs and distribution channels. So now, the true barriers to entry are, in economic terms, dynamic and reputation-based. And with a solid reputation of honesty and integrity and intelligence, a following can be built around asking tough questions that, for whatever reason, be it monopolization of ownership or a state corporate alliance, the mainstream media is just no longer asking. Now, in the case of Tara and others like her, both in Canada and in the US, they've also managed to maintain an ongoing critique of this mainstream media blind spot. And at a time when institutions like Gannett Media, which is the US's largest newspaper publisher, which is shutting down local newspapers at a record rate, and when many venerable major newspapers like the Washington Post are shedding jobs because they've also lost thousands or hundreds of thousands of paid subscribers, the need for this independent voice has never been more necessary. Now, in Canada, the news is no better on this front. Local news reporting by mainstream outlets has witnessed a similar decline. And it's not just happening in small towns across the country. Take Canada's largest city centre, Toronto. We once had several independent TV news channels operating at the same time, places like City TV and Global. And we had a raft of independent voices, both on radio and TV, but they've all been purchased by the same companies. So it's not uncommon now to be listening to news radio on your drive home and then walk in the door and hear the same nightly news broadcast being shown on TV at that same moment. And it's into this vacuum that I think the independent news and reporting of voices like Tara has stepped into. And it's illustrated that every day we see the migration of talent from these mainstay publications and news outlets to places like Spotify, Rumble, and Substack, and Medium. In Canada, for example, Anthony Furey left Sun Media, and in the US, journalists like Li Fang, who recently left his role in The Intercept to start up his own Substack. This is important work, and it's being done independently, online. We had a great time chatting with Tara last time she was on the show, and we felt like we had a lot more to explore. So on today's show, Tara will be sharing with us some of her most overlooked news stories of the past year. Tara's bona fides as an independent journalist and media critic, I think, make her an ideal person to tackle this juicy topic. And I feel confident to say that today's show in particular will offer up something that you won't get anywhere else on mainstream TV, at least in Canada. So I think you're really going to enjoy the show. Please join us after the break and stay tuned when we return and speak with Tara Henley.
More in regards to seniors. The seniors really don't get as much help as they should by the government.
I guess stuff going on probably in third world countries, maybe countries in Africa or Asia that don't really get too much media coverage.
I don't know really what to say, but we need to have a lot of love around us, a lot of harmony, peace, and that's what we need, to light up our spirits.
I would like to hear everybody talk about how nice it is to have friends, get along, and do the right thing by your neighbors, and be happy all the time. That's, I think, the most important, like get together like we had today, talk, go for, just to be nice with everybody and get along, that would be nice. That's the main thing. I like everybody to be happy anyway. My main thing is everybody has to be happy in this world. We only live once, so enjoy it, enjoy your life, do what you can do, and everybody be happy. Think about your family, and always phone your family, get along, try your best.
The news, I guess. The news is sport. It's things I like to watch, yeah.
Sort of maybe helping people out. That's what I'd like to hear about, that more people are getting help than needed in the world. There's always bad things you hear in the media, so I don't listen to news too much. I only go on the web to learn. I want to hear what I want to hear. The rest I just filter out. So I don't know, issues that do well for people, maybe feed people that can't eat, or help people out that don't have homes or homeless. I like to hear more good things like that people are being helped in this world.
Undercover racism. Because I live in a society that I see a lot of undercover racism.
Economic, social issues worldwide and Canadian in particular. And then the same issue in the big city like Toronto or Montreal.
It's very little TV because I'm sick and tired of what I see. I wish they get different formats of, for instance, the news. Let's talk about the news. Why? I don't understand why the news has to be so negative, pessimistic, negative, depressing, you name it. Because what they do, they scoop only the bad stories. Why can't we hear good stories?
Welcome back. So today's show, we again interrogate the media, but this time it's not so much a question and answer as an exploration into the rise of independent media through the eyes of one Canadian who was very publicly, this time last year, announcing her entrance into this space. That person is here today. It's Tara Henley. And Tara is going to tell us a little bit more about that journey and also what lays ahead. In other words, what is it about independent media that, according to Tara, has legs, will continue, and why it's kind of beating the mainstream media at what it used to be very good at, which was telling stories critically and letting the public know about things that they otherwise wouldn't have. So thank you, Tara. Thank you for so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're filming this around the time, almost a year to the day, in which you very publicly left Canada's largest broadcaster, Canada's largest news broadcasting corporation, the CBC. At the time, you had issues both with the content and the way the news was being reported, right? Now, since that time, you've managed to create your own media outlet, the Lean Out podcast, the Substack. You've interviewed amazing people. In that time, in that 1 year, do you have any regrets?
I do not, particularly with the vaccine mandate issue and with the trucker convoy crisis in Ottawa. I was incredibly grateful to be independent at that time and to be able to do the kind of coverage that I felt was necessary.
Can you explain a little bit? Because what was it about your time at the CBC? Because you were telling us just earlier before we were taping, you were doing 2 stories a day. You had a very packed schedule. Now we're going to get into how much more work you're doing on your own, but why weren't you able to tell those stories? What did you feel was inhibiting you?
So I think the best way to sort of understand it is a really stifling environment, and one that I felt was dominated by groupthink. And this was really extreme for me during the pandemic. And that I think there were top-down pressures, I think there were bottom-up pressures, but I think that the best way to sort of understand it is a kind of prevalent groupthink that inhibited our ability to really be as critical as I believe we should have been. And the vaccine mandate issue in particular was one that was very pivotal for me because I did not see the sort of critical thinking that I felt was necessary for a sweeping public policy change like that.
Right.
I did not see that coming through in our coverage, and I found it quite disturbing.
Because it impacted you directly. It was you were one of the public broadcasters, the federal government employers that implemented it, and implemented it rather quickly, as you said, without much debate, and comfort level must have been very different from different employees as to what information they were revealing to their employers, how many colleagues maybe felt like they couldn't work in an environment like that. So that issue was both personal, but it also had these ramifications that it was affecting millions of Canadians, and there wasn't a proper discussion being had on mainstream media.
No. And I felt quite uncomfortable having to declare that I was vaccinated to my employer. I felt that was a very kind of strange thing, which I did go ahead and do and declared. But I was hearing, I mean, as a journalist, you should be talking to a ton of people from a ton of different backgrounds. Right. And I had been hearing for months that there were people that were extremely uncomfortable with this issue, not just the unvaccinated, but also the vaccinated, and ranges of professions and backgrounds. And this was going to be a huge issue no matter what. And the fact that there was so little public debate, I think, created a kind of powder keg that then exploded, that the media was unprepared for.
So that's the next big story. That, again, being on your own, you were able to cover, and we're going to get into the mechanics of how an independent journalist works, because I want the public to hear that too. But that's right. So you had an early warning detection system, if you will, because you sort of stayed in that zone of covering and talking to people that traditionally you would have talked to as a journalist, but you felt that kind of had eased, and there was more of a, you said, call it a group thing, but an internal discussion as opposed to an outward discussion. So you heard from people who were growing more and more anxious about the increasing control over our lives, if you will. And the most extreme form of that would be your own body and what you can or cannot do to your body. So when and I think you were getting to it, right? The events in Ottawa in February, what we called the truckers' protest, which really wasn't. It was more than truckers who were in Ottawa. And that's acknowledged by everyone, right? You weren't caught off guard by that. In fact, you were almost expecting something like it. But I think it's safe to say that for most of your colleagues who remained inside of those mainstream newsrooms, it was a shock. It was sort of, where did this come from? And then they were grasping for answers.
Well, I don't know, because I wasn't in the newsroom at that time, so
Okay,
I don't know
fair enough.
what they were thinking and feeling, but I do know that the coverage reflected a sense of kind of disconnection from the public and from these concerns, and a lack of understanding about where this was coming from. I think during the pandemic, I mean, we really saw an intensification of the class stratification in our society. I mean, you had we called the laptop class, which were at home, they were isolating, they were having less and less and less in-person interactions, and their lives became smaller and smaller and smaller. And then you had a huge group of people that were out there keeping society running, who, you know, this includes the truckers, but many different professions who were exposed to the virus, who may have recovered from it and have natural immunity and had very different views on all of this. And were not as afraid, and were not as afraid of debating all of this.
Isn't that true?
And if you were working from home, doing all your meetings on Zoom, you might not have had contact with that viewpoint. And because the media was not reflecting that viewpoint, I think it was...
Because it too was working from home.
Yes.
Largely, which is a strange thing for a journalist, as you point out.
Yes, so I was a current affairs radio producer. I did, as you say, 2 stories a day, every day. But during the pandemic, except for a short stint when I was directing one of the shows, almost all of the producers, like myself, were at home. And so and in the very early pandemic, you had to get clearance to go out in the field for safety.
Right.
So this is a very different way of operating as a journalist.
And that's an interesting thesis, because, and I'll use that word being an academic, because other people from the first day never stopped going to work. And those that were prevented were only prevented for a short time. Construction workers, factory workers, food processing workers, our retail workers, our healthcare workers. Everyone was on the job. And as you say, their experience during that first year and a half, 2 years, would have been very different from someone who got less and less exposure, and paradoxically more and more fear. So there was a divide of fear from those that had been in the world, as you say, probably got COVID, and those that had remained kind of far from that risk, potential risk. And that set up a cleavage that I think we weren't prepared in Canada to acknowledge. But you could see, because you had still kept your old kind of journalistic intentions and roots, talking to people and being out in the world, even if they told you to stay home. Is that right? Is that a fair comment?
I mean, I think a lot of it too was, you know, seeking out different opinions, talking to friends and family and extended networks, and trying to get a sense of what people were actually thinking about this sort of thing, not just what people were saying online. I also, another big piece of this too, was looking and thinking critically about the data. I mean, as we saw, starting even in October, maybe even earlier,
October 2021, right?
Yeah, breakthrough infections were very common. And so the logic for the vaccine mandates rested on this idea that it stops transmission and infection. And if it doesn't, then my view was we need really robust scientific rationale for why we're doing this. And I didn't see that. And sometimes in interviews, when I would push, you know, I would receive platitudes instead of the robust sort of evidence that I was looking for. And that's a red flag as a journalist. And I didn't understand why we weren't questioning more. Public health officials, doctors, experts are human beings. They're also living through a crisis. They are just as susceptible as everyone else to groupthink, to mistakes, to panics. Things like this should be interrogated incredibly critically, particularly in crisis moments.
And just to bring it back then, you were able to do this because, as we said, in early 2021, you decided to sort of branch out, start your own newsroom, if you will, on the Substack platform, and also on your podcast, the Lean Out Substack and podcast. And you went to other places that others hadn't gone to yet, because we had another round of school closures, not as long as the first ones. But there's another area you went to where you started to ask questions. Are these closures necessary? What costs? Just what are the costs? Maybe there are benefits, but what are the costs? No one was talking about that. What led you there, and what did you kind of find out?
So the school closure issue I was hearing a lot about from parents who were afraid to say things publicly, but who were noticing changes in their children and were terrified about the impacts of having these kids at home. This is like very unprecedented public policy. And again, it did not receive the kind of debate that you would hope that a huge change like that would get. And I did do a lot of interviewing on that topic this year. And what's interesting about that topic is, like, very quickly, it had been so taboo for quite a while, and then the tide turned, and now it is not taboo at all. And we're hearing about it in the New York Times, we're hearing about it all over the place. But these mainstream outlets are about 2 years behind what the discussion was in the independent press. And you know, in terms of trust in media, if you're going to be 2 or 3 years behind on a topic that matters so deeply to parents in particular, you're going to lose some trust.
Yeah. And, you know, there's an interesting also storyline here, which perhaps you touched on, but Canada also experienced the pandemic in different ways. Jurisdictions like British Columbia kind of had a light touch for almost all of it, except towards the end too. I think everyone got caught up in some manic pressure to do something, and BC was no exception. But early on, you know, they kept schools open. They opened schools in June of 2020. They finished their school year and they never closed. In Ontario, we didn't even know that. Like, this is a Canada that's supposedly, you know, coast to coast free. But that's because, as you said before, we were closed off. We weren't allowed to travel even for some of that period of time in our own country. And why is that damaging? Because you stop learning and you become more prone to these groupthink, self-censorship forces, which then prevent solutions. So not knowing that one jurisdiction in Canada had kept schools open and had by far better outcomes than others prevented us from asking the question, why were we fearful? My thesis is that we were feared to be tagged with a stigma of being, say, a Trumper or a populist. And these became stigmatizing ways of stifling debate, which goes back to your point. You saw that, and as a journalist that had worked for so many years, kind of caused you to be concerned.
I mean, there's huge red flags when you're shutting off debate, right? And to your point, jurisdictions were different, but so were countries. I mean, anybody could go on the BBC website and look at articles about different countries and how different countries were even handling these issues, and why was there no debate about that here? I just found it a very, very strange, very extreme moment, and super concerning. And public health, you must have debate. Science, you must have debate. These are issues that absolutely have to be hashed out, and have to be hashed out in the public square. And if we're not doing that, then there's been some sort of turn in our society. And I think that turn is extremely unhealthy, and I think it needs vigorous pushback.
And so with this, we're going to have another segment to talk more about the role of independent media in shining a light on questions that for some reason weren't being asked in the pandemic. But I want to get to your also belief too, that the origins of this turn in the mainstream media might have started a little bit earlier. And of course, there's always been questions about corporate ownership. And as someone from the left, you probably know the whole Chomsky view of media as always being part of some kind of greater corporate and also state kind of pressures. But something did happen around 2016, which you might want to tell us about.
So Matt Taibbi, the independent journalist, has done a lot of work in this area on how the media has changed. I mean, part of it is that the business model has changed. And so the media used to try to appeal to as many people as possible in order to keep advertising revenue up. With Fox News, they pioneered this new business model where you would go after one demographic and you keep that demographic happy. You see that adopted across the media now. Fox News does it on the left, MSNBC does it, Fox on the right.
Although you don't know anymore. You see people like Glenn Greenwald on Fox News.
I mean, we are seeing a dissolution of those categories. But anyways, this is happening all across the media. And then the one really huge turning point was Trump. And the mainstream media was really caught unaware. They really did not expect his election. And there was a shift in what the media saw its role to be. And so previously, the role is you go out, you gather as much facts, or for me, I'm in current affairs journalism, as much viewpoints and opinions to make sense of the news. You go out, you get all of that, and then you present it to the public, and you trust the public to make up its own mind about that. After Trump, there was this view that something had gone fundamentally wrong, that we were in a crisis, that there was some sort of massive kind of shockwave to democracy, and that journalists were not just responsible for collecting facts, but also for influencing public opinion.
And had to pick a side almost. But we'll leave it right there, and we're going to see how that tendency might have been played out 2 years later or 4 years later during the crisis. So when we come back, we'll have more to talk about with Tara, and also how her independent media voice has helped Canadians find out about stories that, unfortunately, the mainstream media has left off the table. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. We're here talking with Tara Henley, podcaster, Substacker, independent journalist, author of Lean Out, A Meditation on the Madness of Modern Life. Very prescient publication, by the way, came out on the eve of the pandemic. And obviously Tara was mining territory that many of us would come to know during those 2 years. But Tara, once again, thank you for joining us. We were talking just before the break about this tendency, where the roots of it might have hit, at least the modern one, not maybe a much older one of corporate influence and so on. But you very much saw a shift that happened in 2016. And even though we were in Canada, we were affected by what happened south of the border, the election of Trump. As you said, elites were caught, again, mainstream was caught unprepared for the election of Trump. You could very well see it. Even on the night of, I remember watching those late night talk show hosts who were almost in tears. You know, they were ready to have a certain pattern and jokes set up, and it was just thrown all to the wayside. We were affected by that. And you were just touching on that. Maybe you can take us through that journey and bring us back to the present and what you saw happen.
So I just saw a shift in attitudes. I mean, there's a huge context to this. So journalism has also simultaneously been collapsing. It's very precarious. People are underemployed. There's a lot of economic insecurity. And then also, I mean, we've seen the profession move from being a working class profession over previous decades to being sort of an elite profession. Because who can afford to work in a really precarious industry, right? It's people who have financial backup. So that's the backdrop of it. But then you also saw this shift with Trump and with this feeling that it's not enough for journalists to just go out and get the facts, that we need to also present those facts in a way that is compelling, that allows the public to make what we see as the right decisions about things. Now, this could be in an election, this could be regarding vaccines, but you saw that shift really take place.
From journalism to nudging, right?
Exactly. Exactly. You also have a huge proportion of young reporters who have not come up in the same structure with the same mentorship. And lastly, you saw the rise of this sort of new political ideology that spread on social media. I don't know what to call it. We say woke. People find that term upsetting, but I don't know an alternative one. But I'm talking about a cluster of quite radical views.
Yeah, and it is very much what we call, and again, in academic speak, there are life cycle or age effects that are perennial. Youth are always different from older work. But then there are what called cohort effects, or what popularly known as generational effects. Like a generation can be different because of their schooling, of what they were exposed to. And you saw that shift. There was a generational shift among certain groups of younger persons who had certain expectations around work, the workplace. And that was very different from the culture that you had been brought up. I just want to loop back to what you said earlier and where you position yourself, because maybe people watching this for the first time, maybe hearing about you for the first time, might not know, but you'd be self-described as a left of center, working class person who has, although you were a journalist and always tried to take a story and cover it as evenly as possible, your own, if you will, ideology was left of center. Would that be fair to say?
Yes. I mean, I I hesitate to say working class because I do have 2 degrees, and
Exactly.
but my mother, when I was a teenager, was a single mother. She cleaned houses. That was the background that I came from. My mom later went to school and got degrees herself and became a professor when I was an adult. So I think I have to be careful about how the way I term
misrepresent yourself. But you would identify with working class
absolutely
issues.
I would, and I think that those are huge issues that do not get represented enough in the media.
Okay. So that's good to know, because and you would begin to sort of call this woke ideology, for lack of a better word, we'll use it, combination with the Trump election sets us up for 2020.
I think so.
Right, it might have played out very differently if those things hadn't happened. Sort of the Trump election in particular. Given that we went through it, and you've highlighted a few of the stories that you were able to tell once you left the CBC. Tell us a little bit more about that independent journalistic endeavor that you are part of, but you are part of a growing movement. And as we've seen declines in the mainstream media, the Washington Post lost apparently 500,000 subscribers in roughly a year, and therefore had to have layoffs. In Canada, we've seen similar consolidation of media outlets and people losing jobs, so becoming more precarious. Yet we've seen this huge growth in independent media, growing followers. Tell us a little bit about that journey and how you find it as an independent journalist. Like, what is a day in the life of Tara Henley now?
Well, it is, I have to say, it's a very, very exciting time, but I have mixed emotions about it. I think we really need a strong, rigorous, free, open mainstream media.
Okay, that's good.
And I really hope that what the independent press is doing is putting enough pressure on the mainstream media to make the mainstream media have some introspection about why they've lost the trust of the public, and to put in place some reforms so that they are better able to do their job. So I feel mixed emotion. I feel incredibly grateful to do the work I'm doing. It's so satisfying. The first piece that I did on the vaccine mandates was with Dion Kohler.
Yeah, colleague of mine.
That is right. The day that we were speaking was the day after the truckers started driving across the country.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So to be able to follow your journalistic instincts, to see a story that you think is undercovered, that needs more, mainstream discussion and debate, and to put out more viewpoints, incredibly satisfying. Incredibly satisfying.
That's a really interesting point, because I won't reveal the journalist, but you can find online. I was contacted by a mainstream journalist and a very prominent news broadcaster about this very story, but it happened 1.5 years later, right? So they're catching up to stories that, again, the independent media was picking up on. Not just you, but even earlier outfits like the Jesse Brown, Canada Land, they did have a more balanced coverage. So it seems like the independent media, to your point, it's actually a very good one, is maybe helping to save media as a whole, waiting for perhaps the mainstream media to sort of come back to some more normalized functioning and not being seen as trying to push a narrative, if you will.
I think a big pivot point in this country was the founding of The Line. Jen Gerson, another one of your guests.
Yes.
I mean, that was an incredibly brave move, and
because that was done early too.
That was very early on, her and Matt Gurney, and the sort of expansion of the viewpoints that were able to be expressed in public and in the mainstream, I saw grow considerably, and I think it was a direct result of what they were doing. And so I think these things do have a huge impact, and part of why they have a huge impact is because the public supports them so much. I mean, the public is so hungry, and the message from the public is so clear. They want us to stop selling narratives, and they want us to go back to, the aspiration of objectivity that's hard to achieve. We're all human beings with biases, but they want us to go back to the basics. And that's what they're supporting with their feet and with their dollars.
Absolutely. And even a larger one in the US, right? The Barry Weiss was common sense. Now it's the free press.
Free press, it's absolutely thriving.
And have you communicated with these people? Like, are you part of a network? Is the independent press, even though you're all independents, have some way of talking with each other?
So Barry Weiss actually republished my letter, my resignation letter from the CBC, and I am in touch with a lot of independent journalists in the States. I just did a series on my podcast interviewing a ton of independent journalists, and so there is a sort of informal network that is growing up, and it's incredibly exciting, and I hope that it kind of improves the health of the overall media ecosystem.
Yeah. So in this sort of chapter now, where we've kind of come around to talking about things we couldn't talk about the last 2 years.
Yes.
What do you see? I mean, you've just laid out a hope, but what do you see in the immediate future? Will independent media keep growing, and therefore eventually happens to what happens to many independents, they get bought out? And is this the way, in a paradoxical way, to save mainstream media? Do you foresee people like yourself going back?
I'm not really sure at this point. I'm not sure that anyone in the mainstream would have me at the moment.
Not yet. So I said it's not going to happen right away.
I think that what's happening with the independent press is that there are huge benefits. We're seeing a ton of freedom. We're seeing a lot of breaking news, but we're also seeing this incredible enriching of the amount of different viewpoints that are expressed. There are scale issues and there are audience capture issues. And so I think all of that is going to start to get worked out in the next little while. So I'm not sure exactly where it all goes in terms of, is this model scalable? I don't know.
But as an independent operating the way you are, it can go on in perpetuity, presumably as long as you have an audience.
Yes, and it has worked out really well for me. I'm super grateful to Substack. It's an incredibly good model. And so the way that this works is I, send out through a newsletter my journalism about 3 to 4 times a week, and the public can choose to support that. And they are choosing to support that, which is incredibly heartening. And what's, I think, probably the most amazing aspect of the last year has just been the volume of mail that I get from the public.
Right. So at this point, the direct feedback you get from the people that you're communicating with, it's not the same if you're working in an organization. So the direct feedback allows you to find new stories, presumably. We talked earlier about how the reason why independent media keeps growing is, to your point, the mainstream media is failing to cover stories that then a year or two later, they are too big to avoid, but you're covering them. Do you find that you get those leads and that kind of information directly from the public?
There are so many stories that I could do a story every single day.
We need 3 Tara Henleys to run the lean out Substack.
The resources issue is another one, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm one person. But so many of these stories, no one wants to cover them. And there are so many out there that it makes the job incredibly easy, actually. And I do think that this, particularly during the vaccine mandate issue, it was really helpful to get that level of mail from the public, to hear people's personal stories about how the divisive political climate and how that public policy drove a wedge between families. And
it did. It really crossed a line. Even the passports, which were also hugely illiberal and ineffective, as we saw once the efficacy of the vaccines was proven not to work in the way it was touted, the mandate went one step further. It was your livelihood, it was your ability to provide for your family, and then it set up a wedge, as you said, between family members, perhaps. Bringing that back is a tough order, but your early reporting provided an outlet. This is what I think is important to state. If people aren't allowed to express themselves, they will then turn to other ways, which might be less productive for society. This is why a democratic free press is so important.
Absolutely. And we need to know what people in our country are thinking and feeling about these major issues. For one, as you say, is an expression outlet, but also because how can people govern effectively if they don't know what the public wants?
That's true. That's right. So the independent media, if anything, should be praised, and politicians should be more than, not worried, but more than grateful that there's this outlet. I know we don't have time to really cover this, but there's a legislation that's just been kind of going through the parliament that might affect your industry, potentially. This is the Bill C-11, perhaps?
Is this the streaming app?
The streaming app.
Michael Geist has done some really good work on this legislation.
He's a professor at the University of Ottawa.
Amazing work on this. Has a great podcast. And there are a lot of concerns about a lot of the legislation that's coming through right now. There is an illiberal turn in our government as well as in our politics, and it's very concerning. It's very concerning.
So at present, anyone can sign up and read your stuff, and you don't provide that many paywalls for many of your articles, if any. But joining a Substack community like Tara's or other independent journalists is a way, paradoxically, of actually maybe saving our mainstream media. So I would encourage all of you to lean out and lean in and read Tara's work, watch your podcasts, and the growing movement of independent journalists that have turned to platforms like Substack. Even Medium is another platform that's very similar. There's a world of knowledge and information that if you think the mainstream media is not covering, you will likely find it in this world. So I want to thank you again, Tara. Thank you so much, Tara, for what you did, not just coming on our show, but for what you did a year ago, so bravely leaving your very good job at the CBC and helping Canadians get through what was a very, very trying time. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
So join us after the break. Well, I'll summarize a bit of what we've learned from Tara's interview and talk about what's coming next on Speaking Freely. So join us after the break.
Less of politics. Too much around is no good.
I love cooking stations. I can watch them 24/7. And politics, that's a no-no for me.
Oh yeah, I guess, honestly, yeah, probably politics, including the Canadian government. Like, I'd probably like to hear less about, Trudeau or Doug Ford, just those guys in general.
I think that people are actually very tired of listening. This is what I hear from the people that I hang out with, because I volunteer a lot. And they're tired of hearing about the wars and people not getting along and things like that. It's very important to do the right thing. It's not important to have these wars and stuff all over the world. So it's very important all over the world to get along. Everybody should be more friendly and get along everywhere you go. And we are really blessed living here in Canada, because Canada is the best place to live when it comes to friendly. We are the most friendliest people. Nowhere in the world does anybody say, I'm sorry or thank you more than we do, okay? So I think we're blessed, and no more wars. No more wars about anything, Just get along and do the best you can. I don't like hearing about wars and stuff like that. It scares me. No shooting, no nothing like that. It's nice just to hear positive stuff all the time,
Problems, I guess. Less problems, less killing, less people doing things that not supposed to do. Fights, arguments, things like that.
I don't know, issues that do well for people. Maybe feed people that can't eat, or help people out that don't have homes or are homeless. I like to hear more good things like that people are being helped in this world. And less animosity towards each other, because people are kind of violent towards each other today. Everywhere you go, there's killings, and yes, we have to hear it, but I don't really want to hear it. It's hard on the general public. That's what I think anyway, but.
Like I said, man, I'd like to see less talking about the garbage that's happening in the city. The crime rate's going up, right? A lot of gunplay, I'd like to hear less of that. Yeah, good news. Like I avoid the news just so I don't have to hear bad news, right? It's too much these days. It's coming at you like, right? Big time. So.
I will expect less talk about small things. Like we hear a lot on the news about small news, very local. They're interesting, but then don't mean anything. Famous cat on top of the tree.
Welcome back. Despite the much vaunted turn to inclusivity in Canadian society, a casual perusal around many cities in this country would find that municipal politics are full of some very familiar and decidedly non-diverse faces. It seems that if you failed in your bid to secure a provincial or a federal leadership role, your fallback was to run for mayor with the backing of a party machinery and name recognition. Here in Ontario, names like Andrea Horwath and Patrick Brown come to mind. However, I think a change is brewing. In the city of Vaughan, where we're taping this show, which is just north of Toronto and home to nearly 500,000 residents, longtime council member Sandra Young-Rocco lost by a mere 800 votes to the former leader of the provincial Liberal Party. And in Toronto itself, a young Asian Canadian female candidate, Lily Chung, beat out the favorite and mayor-endorsed candidate in her riding. And in perhaps the greatest upset of all in Vancouver, Ken Sim, a small business owner, beat out the incumbent NDP mayor, all with a party that he formed just 5 months ago to become Vancouver's first Asian Canadian mayor. These, I think, are very hopeful signs that new voices from new generations of immigrant communities are finally cracking the last bastion of what we call in Canada the family compact. So maybe a true North strong and free is emerging from the rubble of the last 3 years of COVID hell. And the same emergence of new voices from the bottom up in politics is, I think, also happening in another realm, the media. New voices, like the one you heard today from Tara Henley on today's episode, are revolutionizing the media space, both in Canada and abroad. They're telling stories that citizens want to hear told, but for whatever reason are being sidestepped or avoided by the mainstream press. But these stories are being picked up by independent journalists like Tara Henley and her counterparts in Canada and around the world. We need media to interrogate the powerful and to tell the truth and to not be worried about the narrative that emerges. Because as Tara Henley reminds us, shaping opinion is not or should not be the job of a journalist. The job of a journalist should be to tell the truth. Well, thank you for joining us on today's episode. And as always, I encourage you to stay curious and compassionate.